Hi, my scrappy screenwriters, Shari Frost here. This is Finishing Your First Draft. Today, we're going to talk about passive protagonists, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. It is something I have struggled with from the day I started writing, particularly in first drafts. I think it's always challenging to find that balance as you're kind of figuring out who these characters are, what their flaws, how that flaw is holding them back, how they can keep forging ahead in spite of it. So I have spent a lot of time researching this topic and I speak on it often. I think it's an interesting one to touch base on now, particularly as you're starting to gain some momentum with these drafts. So basically, we have our model of protagonists since the time of Aristotle and the Poetics. Aristotle believed very strongly that plot was the most important component of story, and by plot he meant action. He meant a series of actions that forged through a central conflict to an epic battle, which led to enlightenment and growth and change for this character who we've been following. He thought that was even more important than character today. There are lots of conversations about whether or not that's true. I think most people kind of net out on they're sort of intertwined. You can't really have action if you don't have a great character. And how can a character be great if they're not taking action, which is sort of where we are in our conversation today. So I will say there are times when a protagonist can be passive, but that kind of passivity has to be an extreme, because no matter what, it is the protagonist who is driving the story forward. So if in your world your character is so incredibly passive that through their passivity they are driving the story forward, that still works. And we've seen examples of that on occasion. One that's pretty well known, if you haven't seen it, it might be interesting to stream, is A Few Good Men by Aaron Sorkin. It was a play, then a film. And if y'all remember, the Tom Cruise character in that film is the protagonist. And at the beginning, he wants nothing to do with anything going on in that story. He's an attorney. He owes the military some time. I forget all the details. He owes the military some time. They've put him through law school, and he's just kind of, keeping a low profile, keeping the peace, and waiting for the day that he is free and ready to move off into the world and become a hotshot attorney. But of course, this big case falls into his lap, and the Demi Moore character is really, really driven. Now, because the Tom Cruise character won't take action, it makes her start raving mad crazy, and the more he sits back, the more she takes action. So in essence, he's still driving that story forward, because if he wasn't getting under her skin in that way, she wouldn't be taking all the steps that she is taking. And what's really interesting, particularly about this screenplay and this film, is that he is only a passive protagonist until the midpoint. At that midpoint, there's an aha moment where he realizes he can't sit back and take no action any longer. And at that point, he actually becomes an active protagonist. And it's really kind of interesting how it goes right into the too little, too late beats, where because he's done nothing, he's absolutely behind the eight ball. So it's a great example of how keeping him passive in the beginning only accelerates the escalation and the conflict in the back half. We can kind of see this a little bit in Room before we get too deep into it, in those opening scenes when we're still trying to figure out who is the protagonist, because we are immediately in this space with two people. We aren't yet sure. Are there two protagonists? Will one be a protagonist? Whose journey are we going to follow? We're still kind of getting oriented within this story and this world. So in those moments, it may seem that Jack is a passive protagonist. He's such a little boy. He can't conceive of the world beyond these four walls. He doesn't know enough to even have a goal, have a want, have an inner need. He's got the innocence of youth. But it is his passivity, his inability to take any kind of action at all, that launches Ma into action for him on his behalf. So as we get into the story later, we do start to see that they're functioning more as a team. but it's a little bit of a look into when a character can be so passive that the story still actually works. There are other examples. There are models where we have a separate protagonist and main character. For the most part, the protagonist is the main character. We often see that. We saw that in our intro class when we read Dallas Buyers Club. One and the same. That is the traditional standard model. But in a film like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, if you haven't seen that one, I'm using older references. I hope you're all with me. They're fun. That's a fun one to stream. That is a film it's literally called Ferris Bueller. It is all about Ferris Bueller. There is no story without Ferris Bueller. It's Ferris, 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 but he is not the protagonist in that film. Why? He doesn't change. He is Ferris at the beginning. He is Ferris at the end. There is no growth or character arc to his character, but it is his friend Cameron who is in desperate need of the wisdom that only a Ferris Bueller can impart. It is Cameron who needs to lighten up and come out of his shell and embrace life and take it by the reins. So it is Cameron who has this arc and this growth, who is the protagonist, but Cameron isn't doing anything and wouldn't if he weren't taken by the arms, literally, and dragged by Ferris. So there's an example where the protagonist can be super passive because the main character is still leading the protagonist toward his growth. And it makes sense in that kind of story because of his flaw, because his flaw is someone who does hold back, who does sit back. So we kind of see that this is his need and see that he's going to need somebody to take him by the arm and lead him through. So the challenge with first drafts, though, is often that when a protagonist is passive, they're kind of middle of the road passive. They're not quite taking action and driving the story forward, but they're not quite so passive that they are the reason why everybody else around them is launching into action and driving the story forward. They're just sort of there, doing their thing, but the characters around them are becoming more engaging, more interesting. How many of you have had that happen to you? Have you ever gotten that kind of note that like, wow, like, I like your protagonist, but that character there, he's so interesting and funny and fun. It's that fun sidekick who's got humor to it. We can easily have our protagonists who are flawed and maybe not always as compelling as some of the wilder characters in the story. Some of these other characters can kind of take over, and that's something we want to avoid. And that has to do with why that character is suddenly more compelling than the protagonist. What is going on there? Why aren't they taking a backseat to the protagonist? So the easiest way around this challenge is really to lean into the beats. It's instead of sort of sitting back saying, what happens next in my story, which is an easy place to go astray, it's easier, not easier, but it's more effective to say, what beat am I in? What needs to happen in this story for this story to function? Remember, we just mentioned that we collectively agree as humans on what makes a story a story. It is a conflict that yields enlightenment and growth and change and a cathartic experience for the reader or viewer. So we can sit back and watch this film and read the story and not have to slay the monster ourselves. We can experience this same enlightenment, the same life lesson, and the same journey from the safety of our seats, our sofas these days, but still experience that. So we are expecting certain things to happen. And so by leaning into those beats and saying, okay, well, we're in the first half of Act 2, and at this point we know that means our protagonist is trying stuff in the new world, but isn't quite getting it right. That gives us a clue as to what that behavior needs to be. Whereas, once we're back in the Dark Night of the Soul beat, we know what that looks like. And so within our world and within the conflict that we have crafted, we can see what that beat might yield in terms of action for a protagonist. So let me check my notes here. What haven't I talked about? Leaning to the beats. I think that may be it. This is a little weird that I'm talking to myself and not to all of you. If you have questions, please start a thread in the discussion thread beat area, or just send me a message. But as long as really for a screenplay, you don't really want scenes where your protagonist isn't present. You really want your protagonist in every scene and driving that scene forward. Whoops, I hope I didn't just lose you there. So unlike a novel where maybe you might cut to another chapter with a different character who kind of takes the focus of that chapter, we don't have that same kind of flexibility in screenwriting. In screenwriting, we are going to hit the ground running with an opening image, and we are going to follow that straight all the way to the climax. And the more we are focused on that character, and every other storyline, whether it's the B story, is still feeding into that character, you will be able to keep that conflict escalating. So make sure in every scene that character is not sitting back doing nothing, and it isn't another character that is taking action. We are all about keeping the pro in Protagonist. I am so looking forward to your pages this week. Give a shout if you have any questions, and I will speak with you all soon. Happy writing.